To the Social Democrats, Dr. Catherine Murphy.
Thank you. Taoiseach, we know we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and we know inflation is surged up by 5.5%, and that's a 21-year high. Families are struggling with basic necessities. It's getting more difficult for many and a very large number of people to put food on the table and at the same time heat their homes. An increasing number of households can no longer afford to do both. Every facet of daily life has been impacted. There's been huge increases in food, in transport, in energy. We know accommodation is a big one, and of course insurance. When it comes to energy costs, the bills are expected to soar by an unprecedented €1,300 this year. You were asked at the weekend about this, and you cited a number of things that the government were doing, including changes to the budget and the forthcoming €100 in terms of credit as things that are meaningful or make a meaningful difference to people. It's frankly a bit insulting, Taoiseach, to pat yourself on the back in terms of the core social welfare rates, like pensions, which were increased by €5. You were warned before the budget that the pension had fallen in purchasing power by €10.24 since 2019, and that was the last time there was an increase. Given the surge in inflation in recent months, the real value has been eroded further. The €100 credit for energy bills that you claim will be introduced as a matter of urgency is not likely to come for a number of months. For those working families trying to keep the head above water, the government really tinkered around the edges in terms of taxation cuts. We can see that a single person, for example, on a low to middle income of between 25 and 35, by inflation. If we add in things like sky-high housing costs with rents at record highs and a 14% increase in housing prices, the scale of the crisis becomes evident. Taoiseach, I want to ask you, do you think the government has done enough to insulate people from the cost of living crisis? And will the government introduce further targeted supports for those who are struggling to make ends meet?
Thanks very much, Deputy. And at the outset, I want to acknowledge that the cost of living is rising very fast. We'd have a prolonged period across the world of very low inflation. That is now over. We're now seeing inflation at around 5% in Ireland and Britain and other parts of the world too. And we haven't seen that in a very long time. And the rising cost of living is causing a real squeeze on family budgets, as well as rising costs for business. Most of the factors that are driving it are outside of control of the government, at least. It's largely driven by increases in energy costs, the international price of oil and gas, and also disruption to supply chains as a consequence of COVID. It is estimated that inflation will moderate throughout the course of this year, but that doesn't take away from the fact that the impact of rising prices is having a really severe effect on family budgets and is squeezing a lot of families in the state. In terms of what the government can do, what we can do is multifold. You mentioned increases in pay. There's an increase in the minimum wage that's just kicked in. There are increases in pay for public servants. Across the private sector, substantial pay increases are now being awarded to workers, and they're necessary to compensate people for inflation. There's the reduction in income tax, which kicks in this month. I'll come back to that in a moment on foot of your unusual comments a moment ago in relation to that. There's the increases in welfare and pensions, which again kick in this month, and also the reduction, the 2% cap on rents, the freeze on childcare fees, and the €100 grant for energy. But yes, are we looking at other things we can do to help? Absolutely, we are.
Dr. Murphy.
Taoiseach, we're not the same as, I accept that some of this is generated from outside of the state, and particularly in relation to energy. But when you start looking at how Ireland was doing before this, this inflationary pressure has kicked in, the cost of living in Ireland is 36%, or was 36% above the EU average. Our cost of housing is the highest in Europe. The cost of goods and services are the second highest in Europe. Our fuel costs are the fourth highest in Europe. So we're not on an equal par in terms of how this is impacting. And when you add inflation into that, it's putting people, particularly people who are struggling anyway, into a very precarious position where they are actually choosing between heating their home and putting food on the table. The changes in terms of the minimum wage is really eaten up by inflation, more than eaten up by inflation.
Thank you, Deputy.
So we're not on a par with other countries.
Thank you, Deputy.
And that needs to be specifically looked at, Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. You're absolutely correct in saying that the cost of living in Ireland is higher than the EU average. It is important also to point out that average salaries and average wages in Ireland are much higher than the EU average. You have to take both into account when you're considering such matters. But there are two areas where we're particular outliers, and that is the cost of childcare and the cost of out-of-pocket healthcare expenses. As I indicated on Sunday, that's an issue that I'm going to focus on in particular in the next year or two. I do want to take you up, though, on what you said about income tax. You said we tinkered at the edges in terms of what we did to reduce income tax for working people in Ireland. Your party opposed that. You were against income tax cuts. Income tax cuts happened because of this government. And what's that going to be worth for the average person earning about 40,000 a year, or a couple both earning in around that, over the course of 3 years? And we intend to do it over 3 years by widening those tax bands, by increasing those credits. That average couple, both earning about 40,000 euros, will have 2,400 euros a year more in their pocket each year than they would under the Social Democrats or Labour or Sinn Féin. And I really want people to know that, because you can't complain about the cost of living and then say that middle class people and working people should pay more income tax, and they would under you.